The question we're asking tonight is, does God love all the nations? And before you answer that, I want you just to consider this, that there are currently, depending how you count them, 195 countries in the world. In the Old Testament, God focuses on one of them. Pretty much all of the books of the Old Testament are written about the Jewish people, and they're written by Jewish people. The focus is on one nation, not on many nations. So I ask again, does God love the nations? Let me throw another fact at you. The book of Genesis has 50 chapters. 39 of them, chapters 12 to 50, are focused on Israel's patriarchs, Abram, Isaac, and Jacob. They focus on the ancestors of the Jews, and only 3 generations at that. So again, I ask the question, does God really love all the nations? Or let me put another texture on the same question. Are the nations God's plan B? Wonder if you've ever come across that idea, or maybe even thought it yourself. Is the right way to read the Bible that God exclusively loves the Jewish people, but by and large they reject him, not least as their Messiah when Jesus comes? Did God at that point then think, well, this isn't working, I think I'm going to love the nations now? Were the nations a kind of plan B in God's mind? Well, really what I want to show you this evening is one simple thing. Namely, that the nations were always plan A in God's mind. God has always loved the nations and always had a plan for the nations. And what I want to do tonight is I want to briefly show you that in the Bible before giving you a bit of up-to-date information on how the plan is going. And toward the end, we'll touch on some up-to-date statistics once we've done the Bible part. But let's start with the Bible. And really, this is just a super fast biblical theology of the nations. So we start with the fact that the nations were created by God, both in literal terms, of course, physically made by the Creator, but also historically created by God. And you might remember that we saw that in Genesis chapter 11. God had a direct hand in bringing about the diversity of nations. Now, it was in part, of course, a judgment of God. And yet, strikingly, I think, this was also God's greater intention. And I think that's something you see later in the Bible. That actually God doesn't reverse nationhood and language in the new creation. If you think about it, God reverses death, he reverses sin, he reverses curse, but he doesn't reverse nationality. He doesn't reverse language. And so, in one sense, although it was a judgment, God sort of superintended this diversity to take place to his glory. I think then chapter 10 of Genesis is very important too. So the table of nations that we thought about in chapter 10 is really vital. What chapter 10 shows us is God's interest in the nations and his knowledge of the nations. When we did that sermon, quite a few people were asking me about a guy in chapter 10 called Nimrod, because the Bible takes a bit of space to make some comments about this guy, Nimrod. He's called in Genesis 10 a mighty hunter before the Lord. And you might know that he's the ancestor of the Assyrian Empire and the Babylonian Empire. And some were asking, well, is that a negative comment, or is it a positive comment? He was a hunter before the Lord. As I reflected on that, I don't think the Bible is very clear on that. I think the bigger point is that God knows who this guy is. He knows his skills. He knows his culture. He knows everything about this man who will later birth the Assyrian and Babylonian people. He is fully on God's radar. He is known to God. And it's just a reminder, chapter 10, that while the camera will zoom in on Abram's little family from chapter 12, that doesn't mean God's lost sight of all the nations. He knows all the details, and he takes a great interest. But of course, we know that God does more than just take an interest in nations. We saw this morning God's great intention to bless the nations of the earth, and that's Genesis 12. The promise of Genesis 12 is not just that a nation will be created through Abraham. It's that through Abram, all peoples will be blessed. And you might want to circle in your Bible the word all there. It's very significant. All 195 nations, all the nations that were in existence at that time, however many there were, would be blessed through Abram. The promise is not national, the promise is international. A world of curse will be offered a redeeming blessing. And yet it's even more remarkable than that God's going to bless the world. See, we could get the impression from Genesis 12 that Israel's sort of over here, and God's blessing them over here, and the nations are over there, and God's blessing the nations over there. And maybe in our heads we imagine there's some kind of, almost like a pipeline running between the two. That God's pouring down his blessing on Israel, and there's a kind of a pipeline that comes from Israel and blesses the nations as well. But they're separate from Israel. We could get that impression from Genesis 12. The nations will just get the seconds from the table of the Jews. But Genesis 17 is a remarkable promise. This is when God changes Abram's name to Abraham. And he says, no longer will you be called Abram, which means exalted father. You will be called Abraham, which means father of many. This is Genesis 17, verse 5. And here's the key bit. God says, for I have made you father of many nations. Do you see the shift that's going on here? Or maybe I should say what's being made clear here in Genesis 17. It's not just that God's going to make Israel into a great nation with Abram as their father, but Abram himself is going to become the father of many nations. Somehow Abram's going to have many other children. Clearly not physically, not in his physical line, but spiritually. And so it's not just Israel over here and the nations over there, and you might get some of the leftover blessing. Somehow, it's the nations being brought into the very family of Abraham. He's going to be their spiritual father. That's there in Genesis 17. And so even before we get out of Genesis, even before we leave the patriarchs, we see that the nations are at the core of God's saving plan. God knows them, he will bless them, and he even will include them in his family. And so as we go on in the Old Testament, we see then, unsurprisingly, that the nations are going to be very much in view. And we'll cover this really quickly. So in the Exodus, we see that Israel are redeemed as a nation, but the nations are not forgotten in that redemption. There's a very interesting verse in Exodus chapter 12, verse 38, which tells us that many other people went up with the Israelites out of Egypt. You see, there were many nationalities living in Egypt at that time, and it wasn't just the Israelites who left slavery in Egypt. Predominantly it was, but not in the entirety. It's a drop-in comment, a kind of, by the way, there were other people too. An early sign of multinational redemption. And as you go on, of course, in the Old Testament, again you see that the nations are never forgotten. For example, Psalm 117, maybe you've noticed it as you've read the Psalms. It's the shortest psalm in the whole of the Psalter, 2 verses. And interestingly, it is not a psalm about Israel. It is a psalm about the world. Christopher Ash says, Psalm 117 is an evangelistic summons to the world. Praise the Lord, all you nations. Extol him, all you peoples. For great is his love towards us, and the faithfulness of the Lord endures forever. You see it also, of course, in the prophets. This call, this appeal to the nations. Isaiah 45:22. I think this was the verse that converted Charles Spurgeon as a 16-year-old or something. Turn to me, all you ends of the earth, and be saved. See, from the beginning of the Old Testament to the end, we see God's love and desire for the nations. And then as we go into the New Testament, of course, that is taken forward. Think of Jesus. Think of how the Lord Jesus, of course, he did give much attention to the Jewish people, and yet he has a clear heart for the nations. Some of the most famous interactions Jesus has with people in the Gospels is with people who are not Jews. So think about the Samaritan woman at the well, the Syrophoenician woman, the Roman centurion whose son was ill, the Roman centurion at the cross. Hugely important incidents in the life of Jesus, and demonstrating that Jesus has a love for all the nations. And of course then when Jesus then comes to the Great Commission, notice he doesn't say, go and make disciples of the Jewish nation, or of your nation, or of some nations selectively, but of all nations, universally. All nations are to be discipled and baptized in Jesus' name. Jesus says that. The book of Acts works that out. The evangelization of the nations, beginning at Jerusalem, heading to Rome, from the Jews to the Gentiles. We also see it in the preaching. The predominant preacher in the first part of the book is Peter, preacher to the Jews, up to chapter 12, and then it's Paul, preacher to the Gentiles. And then there's the fact that so much of the New Testament letters wrestle with the inclusion of the nations. What I've called the conundrum of the nations. One of the great questions that the early Christians had, Paul and the other apostles had to wrestle with this, was how do we integrate different nationalities into the one church? How do Jew and Gentile relate? Do Jewish Christians need to give up their Jewish practices to make it easier for the Gentiles? Or do Gentiles need to change and become Jews in order to assuage their Jewish brothers and sisters? Or is there something different than both of those options? How do we integrate the world into one church? Letters like Romans, Galatians, and Ephesians, in some ways, are primarily about that issue. How do we integrate a worldwide church? And these are amazing resources for churches today in the UK, particularly in England, where churches are becoming hugely multicultural. And all of a sudden, this material is so needed and so relevant. But then lastly, on this whirlwind Bible tour, we come to the end of the New Testament and to the book of Revelation. And this is hopefully familiar territory. We see, don't we, in chapter 7, that great multitude that no one could count from every nation, but even more than that, from every tribe within the nations and every people, here's sort of people groups, and every language. There's an encouragement to those who are in the business of Bible translations. We'll come back to that later on. Every language, in all of their diversity, they stand in unity and they bring worship to God and to the Lamb. And then an amazing verse, one of my favorite verses on the nations in the Bible, Revelation 21:26. After describing the city of God, the New Jerusalem, in all of its beauty and glory, we're told that the glory and honor of the nations will be brought in to the city, into the New Jerusalem. The scattered nations of Babel have now been gathered up by Christ. And not only that, but he is bringing all of their redeemed diversity and culture and glory into the city. They're not leaving the culture outside. They're bringing the redeemed culture into the new heavens and the new earth. It's a vision to inspire our evangelism. It's a vision to fuel our prayers. And it's a vision to broaden our horizons from just focusing on our nation to seeing how big God's plan really is. So that's the overview. And that's the answer to the question. And maybe we kind of know that that's the right answer, but it's good, isn't it, to see some of the working across the Bible, just so that we're kind of clear that this really isn't just a New Testament idea, but it's rooted all the way back from Genesis on. Now, how is the plan going? There's a good question. How's the plan going? What's the current state of play in God's desire to reach the nations? There was a huge conference recently. It happens every so many years. It took place in Lausanne, or it was the Lausanne conference. It was in South Korea. It's basically a worldwide mission conference. And people go from every country of the world, representatives, mission representatives, and they share with one another about what's going on in world mission. And for that conference, they did a couple of years of research, and they put together a digital booklet called The State of the Great Commission. Now, this is online. It's free to just download. It's like 500 pages long, although about 100 pages are graphics. Really interesting stuff. What I thought I would do in the rest of the time is give you just a very brief selection of some of what's going on in world mission in 2024. So here's a few snapshots of mission. Where do you think most missionaries are being sent from today? Like, what countries are they going from? And what countries do you think missionaries are mostly going to? Well, have a look at this graphic. I hope it's probably going to be hard to see some of these on the screen. But what this graph does, it looks at 6 different regions of the world, and it compares statistics from 1970 and 2024. So what were the numbers in 1970? And then 50 years later, what's the number now? You'll see, for example, if you look at Europe, which is kind of in the middle, in the darker blue, the blue bars going to the right are the number of missionaries that Europe are sending. So this is the number that Europe is sending to the world. And you'll see if you look at the blue bars to the right that number, the top bar, the long one, is in 1970. You'll see that the number of missionaries we are sending has massively gone down in 50 years. From about 150,000 missionaries to about half that number in 2024. On the other hand, if you look to the left-hand blue bars to do with Europe, that's the number of missionaries who are coming to Europe from other continents of the world. And you'll see there that number has also doubled. So Europe is sending half of what we used to, but we're also receiving double the amount of people that we used to who are evangelizing our own continent. Also, just observe a couple of other things there. Observe Africa at the very top, which has been a real mission-receiving continent historically. You'll notice that missionary going to Africa has greatly reduced over the last 50 years, but the numbers that Africa is sending out has more than quadrupled. So Africa is becoming quite a big sending continent. Asia, which is the next one down, you'll see the kind of light green. Look at the right-hand side. Look at the tiny percentage of missionaries that Asia was sending out 50 years ago. Well, that's way more than quadruple, isn't it? So the continent of Asia is now sending out a huge number of missionaries across the world. There's a word on the right-hand side, you might see at the top of that paragraph, polycentric or poly-centered. It means many centers. And this is what people are talking about in world mission now. It's no longer that missionaries are going from one part of the world, like UK and North America, to everywhere else, but actually all parts of the world, many parts of the world, are sending missionaries everywhere. So there's this kind of crisscross going on. Here's another slide. Here are the top countries who are sending out missionaries. Now, you'll see at the top right-hand side that the United States of America is still sending the most missionaries by some margin, I might add. But you will notice the next countries in that list. The top senders of missionaries are Brazil, South Korea, the Philippines, and Nigeria. These are places that used to be places you sent missionaries to. Now they are the senders. They are the people sending out folk on gospel mission. An interesting wrinkle on this, we'll go on to this next slide about money and finance. Here are the parts of the world where Christians have most wealth, where Christians are earning the most money. And so this is an interesting statistic. Whereas missionary sending is slowing down from North America, whereas sending from Europe is declining in terms of people, you'll notice that North America and Europe are by far the wealthiest Christians in the world. So we are the ones with the financial cash who can largely support world mission. So the Western church still has a hugely important part to play, not only in going, but actually, maybe most of all, in financial giving. A good question for a Western Christian is, what could your giving do for world mission? That might be your most important contribution to world mission. Something else we should talk about is what is called unreached peoples. What's an unreached people group? An unreached people group is a group of people who have limited access to the gospel, and where usually less than 2% of people are Christians. But where are these nations? Where are these, often not whole nationalities, it's like people groups living within nations. Where are the unreached people groups? Well, you'll see there that the sort of light green in this big circle here is the continent of Asia. So by far, the great majority of unreached people groups are in the continent of Asia. Partly that's because also most people in the world are living in Asia, so there's a kind of a correlation there. And then lagging not all that far behind there is the continent of Africa. Let's look at this in specific countries in the next slide. What country in the world do you think has the most unreached people groups? Well, if you can read, you'll spot it. It's quite striking, isn't it? By quite some margin, it's the country of India. That's interesting, isn't it? I kind of think of India as a kind of quite a reached country. You know, British Empire went there and all that. But actually, it's extremely mixed in India. It's a huge country, and there's vast parts of it, vast sections of it, where there's no Christians at all, and where it is classified as unreached. There's a huge number of unreached people in Pakistan. You could maybe ask Liz about that. I'd be very interested to learn more about the dynamics of that. China, Bangladesh, Nepal, Indonesia. Notice also that some of the Western countries also have unreached peoples in them. So the United States, for example, has 98 unreached people groups living within the United States. These are perhaps people that are living largely culturally apart. They don't really engage with culture. They don't try and really speak English. And they have very little engagement with Christianity. So let's just be aware of kind of some of these dynamics. Here's another question. What religions, if any, do unreached peoples have? Like, who are these people that we're trying to still reach? It's interesting when you look at this, isn't it? The kind of lighter green, most of the unreached people groups are Muslim. But the kind of darker green there, many of them are also Hindu. And you'll also see there a good chunk of them in the kind of teal there are agnostic. There's a huge number of people who just don't know what they believe at all. The kind of rising culture of secular people across the world. I was kind of challenged when I saw these statistics. I thought, I wonder how much time I just spend in prayer, praying for Muslim people, praying for Hindu people. When was the last time I read a book on reaching Muslims or Hindus? These are the predominant people who remain unreached with the gospel. Now here's an intriguing graphic. You might think that with need in these unreached places and among these groups, you might think that the world church would be then targeting the unreached peoples of the world. But the smaller green circle on the left are the amount of current missionaries that are reaching the unreached part of the world. And the big blue circle, and all those lines represents a certain number of thousand missionaries. You see that to the right. All of them heading to the blue areas are going to the mission field in what are characterized as reached places. Now, these reached places have still got great gospel need. I mean, there still might be a huge percentage of the population that don't know Jesus, and there is need in these places. But actually, where the greatest need in the world is, the fewest percentage of missionaries are actually going. And often there's reasons for that. Typically, these unreached people groups are not open or welcome to having Christians come among them. And so it's very difficult to get access. But I think this should be shaping our thinking when we come to world mission. Maybe if you're someone, maybe you're a young person and you're thinking, maybe in the future I want to consider going out to the mission field, I wonder if you would think about prioritizing or at least praying seriously about whether you could head to a place where there's an unreached people and not an area of established gospel witness. Another thing to touch on briefly is Bible translation. It's wonderful, isn't it, to see the acceleration of countries who are now receiving the Bible in their own languages. But there's parts of the world where people don't have a full Bible, or they've only got small selections of the Bible. And you might see towards the right-hand side, the sort of light green is Asia. There's something like 1,200 translations going on right now in Asian languages, and then down the bottom you'll see an even greater number actually of languages being translated in the continent of Africa. These are the places where people still need God's word in their own language. Now, just breaking that down further on the next slide, again, I don't know how easy it is to see there, but basically these chunks are people that have none of the Bible translated, or they've got sections of like testaments translated, or they've only got tiny little portions translated. Let me give you a couple of headline figures here. Almost 600 languages in Africa have nothing in their language at all. Like, there's not even a translation started. And there's over 700 languages in Asia where there's no Bible translation happening at all. And yet, at the same time, there is enormous excitement because, as we've said, Bible translation is accelerating, particularly with the use of technology. I know we're kind of scared of some aspects of AI, but presumably some aspects of that are actually going to help translation and might speed things in the year ahead, but something for us to pray about. The continent of Europe. There's a whole section in the State of the Great Commission report about Europe. In fact, every continent gets its own section about it and what the needs are and what the blessings are. And the overall thrust, I thought it would be just good to finish kind of more or less on this, that this overall thrust about the area of the world that we live in is that Europe needs to be re-evangelized. The gospel needs to take over Europe once again among people, most of whom really know little or nothing about it. And the report pointed out 6 areas that we should be aware of as we think of mission in Europe, and I want to just briefly touch on them. So the first one it talks about is the recovery of truth in Europe. And it makes the point that even in our postmodern age, a lot of European people are still searching for meaning and some kind of truth to base their lives upon. Now, a lot of people aren't thinking that Christianity is that truth, right? They're not necessarily thinking we've got it, but they are looking for it. And they're looking for a truth that is also connected to experience, relationship, and beauty. In other words, it's very important to European people, not only that something is true, but that it actually has an effect on your life and in your experience. It's authentic. It's also important to them that something is actually attractive and beautiful. People are weary of sham Christianity, but the real thing is very appealing to them. And so that's something for us to think about and pray about, that we would be part of restoring truth. Then a second thing the report talks about is morality, reshaping morality. And the report talks about the fact that in Europe, people are still concerned about morality. Justice is a very big thing in Europe and in the Western world. Again, very often people don't see the church as the place to find morality. And I guess there's a challenge for us to change that perception. We need to remind people, of course, that so much of Western morality is based upon the Bible, the Judeo-Christian scriptures. And as a church, we need to be active in taking a stance on moral issues. It's actually part of our witness to a culture like Europe. The third thing it talks about is community, rebuilding community. It talks about how loneliness is epidemic in European cultures. Family life is breaking down. Communities are kind of coming apart at the seams. People don't have church to hold them together, family life to hold them together. Many people are migrants coming into Europe, and many of the local people are not accepting them readily. The church can be a shining light when it comes to community. Community itself isn't evangelism, but it provides a massive platform for evangelism, and it's something we should be just doing anyway. Then fourthly, the report talks about digital, reconnecting digitally, and this is just the simple idea that, this is all across the world, but particularly in the Western world, people are spending more of their time on their phones, on their iPads. They're online rather than in person. And so the challenge here is really thinking about, how do we do mission in that kind of context? How do we do evangelism through someone's phone? How do we do discipleship through someone's iPad? How do we do some training online? Yes, there are downsides of technology, but there's also great opportunities to reach people as well. I was just saying this to someone this morning. The new Glenn Scrivener course, 321, We think about courses in churches. They're now doing that just directly into people's homes. It's like scan the QR code, and you don't need to come to church. From your home, we'll just beam you all the videos, and you binge watch them, and then you can directly message Glenn himself, who's probably got way better answers, let's face it, than some of the group leaders in our own church, including myself. This is the wonderful opportunity that digital gives us. Fifthly, the European section spoke about respecting creation. This can sometimes be a bit of a divisive topic among Christians, can't it? But I think we have seen in Genesis, it certainly strengthened my belief in studying Genesis, that creation does matter. Creation is not an incidental part of salvation. We see that in Genesis, don't we? It's not that the only thing that matters is the salvation of human beings. God puts animals into the ark and brings them out as well. We've seen some of the Romans 8 that Paul speaks about, of creation groaning as it waits for the redemption of humanity. Here's the thing that the report points out. The environment is a big moral issue for many young people in particular. And a church that looks completely indifferent about the environment is probably putting up a barrier that it doesn't need to put up. There's something there to think about. And then sixthly and finally, with respect to Europe, it talks about demographics, changing demographics. Falling birth rates in Europe, aging, that then means aging populations. And aging populations, well, that then means a number of knock-on things. It means that the care of the elderly will be an increasing priority for society and for the church. It also means that evangelism among the elderly is going to have to become a bigger priority if most of the society is over a certain age. And not only the changing of age demographics, but also the change of cultural demographics. As we know, there is huge migration as people are coming into Europe. And many Europeans don't want the migrants to come. We're all familiar with that idea. But the church should be able to see that these many people coming in are not only our brothers and sisters in the brotherhood of man, but actually it is these very people who are often the most open to the gospel of Jesus Christ. Where are some of the highest percentage of people becoming Christians? In refugee camps, as they fled their country and as people are sharing the gospel. And many of these people are coming from some of these no-access or limited-access countries, and then as they come into Europe, they're getting a free opportunity to hear the gospel. And so there's a massive opportunity here, even as demographics change. Now, that's a bit of a quick run through. This is not a complete report, and it's certainly not perfect. There were quite a few things that I kind of wish they might have included in that report. I mean, one thing I thought that was hugely missing in it was just the whole idea of the European church needing to hold fast to the truth, because you can't proclaim the truth if you give away the truth, can you? And it seems to me that with crumbling denominations and many churches giving way on biblical teaching on sexuality, I do think that needs to be a front and center issue as we think about Europe and how it's going to be re-evangelized. So it's not the complete picture, but I think there are some really helpful things there for our prayers. Lastly, before we come to communion, one more little graphic. Something that church leaders from across the world were asked in all the different continents was, how seriously do you believe the church in your part of the world takes the Great Commission? So in other words, do people in your church and your culture, do they think the Great Commission is life and death serious? Do they think it's kind of moderately important? Or do they think it's not all that important in the priorities of their lives? Obviously, this is a very subjective question, but it's interesting that the lowest scorers across the world to this question, as the pastors reflected on it, were in the Western world. It's pastors in North America, pastors in Europe who said that their congregations seemed the least interested in the fulfillment of the Great Commission. Isn't that quite striking? We're the part of the world that surely needs the Great Commission to succeed more than any other. And yet it's other parts of the world that are more enthralled with this gospel project. I think that should be a challenge to us. Maybe materialism has dampened our enthusiasm. Maybe discouragement at falling numbers has dampened our confidence in the Great Commission. But God has promised that he will bless all the nations. He loves the nations. And if that's so, the question is, do we?